what your sexual education was like growing up? Did you mainly learn from friends, or did you learn from sneak peeks of porn on the internet, or skims of women's magazines? Did your parents give you a thorough discussion, or did they beat around the bush? Was the conversation purely technical or full of sage wisdom? Was it corroborated in school? I'm asking all of this because we're going to explore how the hell so many grown American people don't know the basics of their own body, sex, STDs, or pregnancy. From calling yeast infections STDs to spreading rumors that periods are unhealthy and that only gay men are susceptible to HIV. Where did we go wrong? Turns out, this is a culmination of years of tradition, ignorance, and often conservative values coming to bite us in the ass. Prior to 1900, the home was the primary place children learned about sex. The information was usually minimal, passed down by poorly educated parents, or gathered by kids seeing animals have sex, as most of the population was agrarian. There were a few heavily censored pamphlets that discussed what was normal and moral between married couples, or what was appropriate behavior for young unmarried men or women. For example, Sylvester Graham, the man who inspired the creation of the graham cracker, wrote a passionate book to young men imploring them to not only be chaste, but to not masturbate, or they'd risk the chance of essentially rotting from the inside. There was also John Harvey Kellogg, creator of Kellogg's cereal, who taught so fiercely against masturbation that he even recommended castration for boys who couldn't stop touching themselves. The few public schools to exist prior to the 20th century didn't engage in sex ed, as most were guided by religious expectations, and parents believed speaking about sex to be immoral. But during the progressive era and beyond, there were some changes, and not all were for the best. In this episode of Let's Talk About Sex History, we'll be discussing youth, morality, and sex ed in the 20th century, and what it all has to do with us here in 2018. During the flurry of social reforms that took place during the first 2 decades of the 1900s, one of the biggest was the social hygiene movement. It took off in 1905 after Prince Amaro established the Society of Sanitary and Moral Prophylaxis with his so-called campaign of education. He and other social hygienists in the Women's Christian Temperance Union and the YMCA believed the problems of sex, namely STDs, came from ignorance rather than evil or malignance. You have to understand the atmosphere of the time. In 1906, when the editor of the popular Ladies' Home Journal printed polite articles about venereal disease, he lost 75,000 subscribers. So this is what social hygienists were facing. Ultimately, they believed that attempting to prevent sexual vices in youth rather than trying to reform or re-educate adults was more worthwhile. Morrow also believed sexual education should not only bring chastity in women, but men as well, stating he wanted correction of the false impression instilled in the minds of young men that sexual indulgence is essential to health and that chastity is incompatible with full vigor. It would be 7 years before sex ed in schools went through a trial period, and boy were those 7 years filled with disagreements. For one, nobody could agree on how sex ed would actually be taught, like where the hell everybody stood on masturbation. Social hygienists also disagreed on whether sex outside the marriage should be discussed. Critics, including the Catholic Church, were certain that discussing sexuality with impressionable adolescents would lead to immoral behavior, destroying their natural innocence. Other people were concerned that by teaching the youth about sex, schools were commandeering a role meant for parents. Others simply believed their children didn't have access to inaccurate info, so there was no need for schools to correct any misinformation. In 1912, the National Education Association passed a motion to teach sex ed in schools, with Ella Flagg Young, the first female superintendent of a major urban school system, expected to lead a trial run in Chicago during the 1913 school year. She proposed 3 lectures be delivered, utilizing medical experts and splitting the 20,000 students by gender. She planned to discuss physical facts, venereal disease, and the importance of abstinence. The school board and many parents in Chicago disapproved, so Ms. Young resigned. The program only lasted 1 semester in Chicago, but across the country, schools began surreptitiously implementing sex ed in biology and home ec courses. The debate raged on. While in 1914 the National Education Association again resigned to teach sex ed in schools, former President William Howard Taft said, "Sex education is full of danger if carried on in general public schools. I deny that the so-called prudishness and the avoidance of nasty subjects in the last generation has ever blinded any substantial number of girls or boys to the wickedness of vice or made them easier victims of temptations. But in 1919, the US government officially supported sex education. America was changing. A 1920 study of a small town called Muncie in Indiana revealed that more teenagers were engaging in petting or sexy rubdowns and kissing, showing that exhibiting sexuality in youth was becoming more acceptable. There were a lot of new temptations that plagued the youth from the 1920s to 50s. Public dance halls meant flirting in close company, compulsory public schooling put boys and girls in close proximity like never before, teenage courting became more popular, car culture meant more privacy and brought about lovers' lanes. Films of the 20s through 50s, while modest to us now, were increasingly risque for the period. Comics depicted sexuality that frightened parents and moralists. So of course, during those decades, sex ed, if offered in school, had the goal of encouraging premarital abstinence and faithfulness. In 1922, the Public Health Service warned schools in a manual to not call programs sex education to avoid controversy with parents. So for the next few decades, sex education continued to be discussed lightly in classes like biology as the birds and the bees. In the 40s and 50s, the term family life education was the term of choice. Schools often showed social guidance films that reinforced middle-class norms in heterosexuality. But these films use euphemisms to keep from being considered obscene. The US government even sponsored films like The Gift of Life and The Science of Life. These were cringeworthy, with The Gift of Life warning that masturbation may seriously hinder a boy's progress towards vigorous manhood. It is a selfish, childish, stupid habit. Films were also peppered with eugenicist ideas that encouraged young people to select mates based on physical attractiveness. In the 1940s, Coronet Instructional Media Company was the big dog, producing films meant to teach teens traditional and gendered values.
Yoo-hoo! Ginny thinks that she has the key to popularity, parking in cars with the boys at night. When Jerry brags about taking Ginny out, he learns that she dates all the boys, and he feels less important. What about Ginny? Does that make her really popular? Do the boys and girls like her? Is she welcome to join this group?
Hi, Betty. Ellie. You can rest your tray here, Ginny, for a minute. Thanks.
No,
Thanks,
girls
Jerry.
who park in cars are not really popular. Not even with the boys they park with. Not when they meet at school or elsewhere.
In 1948, some conservative parts of the country banned a polite sex ed movie called Human Growth, which had been screened for 2,200 Oregon students and profiled by Life magazine, but it was ultimately popular and advocated for a more open-ended discussion about sex between adolescents and authoritative figures. There were also preventative comics geared towards youth after the 1940s when the cure for syphilis was discovered. Here's a comic I found at the Atlanta Archives called Kid Poncho. In it, the main character has sex with a pretty, lovely girl and gets a sore on his penis. When he visits his doctor, he learns how syphilis spreads even from nice girls, and that for anybody who hopes to marry and wants healthy babies, my advice is to not sleep around. Enter the 60s. The movies were racier, the music was more explicit than ever, magazines like Playboy set the tone of sexual freedom, but perhaps the biggest impact on sex ed that emerged during the sexual revolution of the 1960s was the approval of the birth control pill. It fell between two polarizing arguments about overpopulation and teen pregnancy, and beliefs that the pill would make women more promiscuous. On one hand, people wanted to address the problem of teen pregnancy, and on the other hand, they didn't want women out here with control over their reproductive rights. Schools struggled to decide whether or not to include information about contraception in the curriculum, fearing casual sex and/or orgies would follow. The American Social Hygiene Association, who had the most control over sexual education at that time, decided to continue endorsing abstinence and declined to teach about contraception. This spurred Planned Parenthood medical director Mary Calderone to found the Sexuality Information and Educational Council of the U.S., or SIECUS, and the concept of comprehensive sex education was born. SIECUS believed in a values-neutral approach in which students should be equipped with all the knowledge and allowed to make their own decisions about premarital sex. In 1966, the U.S. Office of Education funded 645 agencies to develop sex ed programs, and SIECUS was enlisted to design a training manual for teachers. It didn't hurt that the emphasis on family planning was growing. Even still, the growing religious right tried to fight back. Titles like "Is the Little Red School schoolhouse the place to teach raw sex, argued that parents were the only appropriate source of information. In 1970, Nixon signed Title X into law, a program dedicated to family planning education and services. Between 1969 and 1976, there was a huge increase of school districts teaching contraception and sex ed. It was during the 70s that sex ed became more about preventing pregnancy rather than preventing teen sex. By the late 70s, about 35% of private and public schools had sex ed programs, but the content in respective districts wasn't always the same. Some employed older programming and ideas, while others embodied the spirit of the sexual revolution. New sex ed films of this period were much more explicit than those previously made. Some even showed interracial couples and discussed homosexuality, gasp, or questioned gender roles. In this short time of progressiveness, the religious right began organizing against the concept of sex ed in schools. Many were appalled by certain school districts that offered on-campus clinics, anonymous STD testing, and free contraceptives. By 1993, there were over 500 such on-campus clinics around the country. But opponents quickly realized they'd never be able to banish sex ed, and instead focused their efforts on making it all about abstinence. The election of family value-touting Ronald Reagan brought about the Adolescent Family Life Program in 1981 to promote self-discipline and other prudent approaches to the problem of adolescent premarital sexual relations. The AIDS crisis, along with the increasing visibility of sex in pop culture, fanned the flame of desire to return from comprehensive sex ed to abstinence only. Over 300 organizations existed with the goal of eliminating comprehensive sex ed. Even still, sex ed grew in popularity during this period, with only 6 states mandating it in 1980 and that number jumping to 17 in 1989. But how it was taught varied. The basics included puberty, STDs, and pregnancy prevention, but conservative districts that emphasized abstinence skipped out on pregnancy prevention and included fear-induced lectures on STDs. But the majority taught safe sex over abstinence ed. This was partly due to Reagan's Surgeon General Everett Koop in the wake of the AIDS crisis, who urged for comprehensive sex ed as a public safety measure. By 1993, 47 states mandated sex ed in schools. Sex ed was a major hot topic on school boards across the country in the 90s, with parents heavily disagreeing on what should define comprehensive. Schools that took the comprehensive route were including detailed descriptions about how STDs were spread, and some parents were appalled to learn their kids were being taught minimally about anal sex. The next big change in sex ed came from Clinton in 1996 with his Welfare Reform Act. 2 years earlier, Clinton had fired his Attorney General Joycelyn Elders for advocating for masturbation, an act that netted applause from Republicans. Yes, that was just 24 years ago. Joycelyn Elders was the same woman dubbed the Condom Queen by conservatives for advocating free contraception for public school students. She was also pro-choice, saying that Americans need to get over their love affair with the fetus. In Clinton's Welfare Act, a provision was included that created a grant for abstinence education. The thinking behind this was that generational poverty was linked to behavior in poverty, and that teaching personal responsibility and sexual control would break the cycle. Premarital sex was essentially classed as a reason for poverty. This had a dramatic effect, as the percentage of abstinence-only sex ed programs had been 2% in 1988 and jumped to 23% in 1999. When George W. Bush entered office, he allotted more money towards abstinence-only programs in 2005 by cutting funding for local schools, food stamps, childcare, and healthcare for veterans. He did this only less than a year after the Waxman Report had been released. The report, initiated by House Representative Henry Waxman, investigated the information being taught in sex ed programs, and it made it clear that America's kids weren't being taught properly in abstinence-based programs. Examining 13 of the most commonly used curricula, the report concluded that 11 of them, used to teach millions of kids in 25 states, contained lies and misinformation. In these programs, sex was often equated with death, disease, and danger. Facts about STDs and condom use were skewed, and facts about the effectiveness of abstinence-only sex ed, which we'll get into in a moment, were ignored throughout the rest of the Bush presidency. In 2000, $60 million was awarded for abstinence-only education, but by 2008, that number was $176 million. Even worse, during that time, the number of states that required sex ed dropped from 47 to 22. When Obama entered the scene, he fully supported comprehensive sex education and called for the elimination of all funds previously devoted to abstinence education. Going a step further, he created the Teen Pregnancy Prevention Program that would aid comprehensive sex ed organizations in fighting teen pregnancy. The program was successful, with teen pregnancies declining 41% between 2010 and 2016. This is the same program Donald Trump planned to defund. And if you thought I was done, Trump just brought the total spending budget on abstinence-only education programs up to $100 million. So how effective is abstinence-only education? A 2009 report by the Texas Freedom Network Education Fund not only revealed just how much abstinence-only education had proliferated schools under Bush's tenure, but how bad the programs were. They analyzed curriculum from over 96% of Texas's school districts. More than 94% of them were teaching abstinence-only education. Less than 4% were teaching anything about responsibly preventing pregnancy and STDs. 2% were ignoring sex ed completely. Most ignored LGBTQ youth, downplayed the effectiveness of condoms, and endorsed attitudes tantamount to slut-shaming. Even worse, this curriculum was widespread in other parts of the country. That same year, Texas eliminated its health education requirement. As a result, a follow-up report on Texas sex ed programs in 2016 revealed that the percentage of school districts teaching abstinence-only education decreased from 94% to 58%, but the number of districts teaching nothing at all jumped from 2% to 22%. It's no wonder that Texas consistently ranks in the top 5 states in numbers of teen pregnancies and is #1 in repeat births for teens. Across the board, research shows that adolescents subjected to abstinence-only education are less likely to use contraception when having sex. STD rates among teens are higher in areas with abstinence-only education. In Mississippi, where sex ed isn't required and any sex ed programs taught must be abstinence-only, they bounce between #1 and #4 every year in teen pregnancies. Mississippi is the same place currently experiencing an AIDS epidemic and ranks among the top 5 states with gonorrhea and chlamydia. It could all be so different. In Denmark, youth are given a comprehensive sex education that encompasses consent, pleasure, and LGBTQ issues. This all rests on the ideology that young people can't be expected to act responsibly if they don't have all the information and choices revealed to them. In 1998, the director of the Danish Family Planning Association said, "From the outside, it seems that we in Denmark have the most liberal system of adolescent sexual and reproductive health and rights. Seen from the inside, however, we don't tend to think that we have a very liberal system. We tend to think that we have a very practical and pragmatic approach to the fact that young people do start having sexual relations somewhere in their teens." The average age for first-time sexual encounters in both America and Denmark is right around 16.7 years, but a 2005 study revealed some differences between how Danish and American teens approach sex. Researchers noted that Danish teens were more likely to talk about sex in terms of mutual pleasure and responsibility, less likely to confuse love and sexual desire, less likely to experience rape, more likely to use contraception, less likely to get pregnant, or have an abortion or STDs. Danish teens also found it easier to talk to parents about sex, and there were way fewer 11 to 14-year-olds having sex than among the American group. As for American teens, researchers found that they were more likely to place blame on women in a sexual situation gone wrong, and had higher rates of teen pregnancy where the fathers were between the ages of 20 and 29. At the time of this study, the teen birth rate in America was 24.2 per 1,000 girls, while the rate was just 4 per 1,000 girls in Denmark. In related information, Denmark doesn't have private prisons, the industrial prison complex, nor do they rely on prison slave labor. For every 100,000 citizens, only 66 are in prison, compared to America, where for every 100,000 people, roughly 707 are in prison. At the end of 2015, the CDC reported that the rates of syphilis, chlamydia, and gonorrhea were at an all-time high. Congenital syphilis, in which a pregnant woman transmits the disease to her baby, had a 6% increase between 2014 and 2015. 2/3 of the people diagnosed with chlamydia were teenagers and young adults from 15 to 24. 40% of the reported gonorrhea cases were from the same group. The super scary part? The bacteria that causes gonorrhea is becoming resistant to antibiotics. All of these statistics were during the Obama administration, when healthcare and reproductive resources were at least minimal priorities. What can we expect the state of our collective sexual health to be like during Trump America? Under Donald Trump, Betsy DeVos, and Valerie Huber, abstinence-only sex education is rebranding itself as sexual risk avoidance programs. And as I mentioned before, the number of states that require any sex ed at all is under 22. Under Obama's guidelines, organizations that received money for sex ed had to use curriculums on an evidence-supported list. Under Trump's new guidelines, evidence doesn't matter. Organizations now must simply adhere to requirements that support personal attitudes and beliefs that value sexual risk avoidance. This does not bode well for the sexual health of not only teens, but for the country. Adolescents and teens shouldn't have to rely on friends, the internet, or embarrassed, strict, or misinformed parents for sexual information. With these abstinence-only sex ed programs allowed to flourish, there won't just be more men on the Twitter timeline claiming that long labia lips mean frequent sexual activity, but more STDs, unplanned pregnancies, heteronormative attitudes, and confusion about consent. I encourage you to think about how all this can be impacted by dwindling healthcare coverage, stagnant wages, and increasingly unaffordable housing. Do you believe keeping teens shrouded in innocence and ignoring their hormones is advantageous? Or do you support comprehensive sex ed? If you're a subscriber of Intellectual Media, I'm pretty sure it's the latter. But what does your idea of comprehensive sex ed look like? Is it all about safe sex and the use of contraceptives? Or does it include combos about consent, the LGBTQ community, masturbation, or even pleasure? I'd love to hear from you, so leave a comment. This has been Let's Talk About Sex History. Thanks so much for watching.